I'm going to read you a statement. Okay? Here we go. This statement was written over 3,000 years ago. And this statement goes like this. This is what you are to say to them. Though the people you are going to conquer have fortified cities, just as the heavens are high above the earth, so the people's power will be above yours. Do not be afraid or terrified, because they are a dead people before you. They are only an obscure, meaningless thing, and their idols I will give over to you. These words were spoken to whom? To Joshua, the successor of Moses. And these words encouraged Joshua to do what? To conquer the promised land. But was it really that easy? Was conquering a land full of fortified cities and powerful nations really that simple? Well, let's find out in today's episode. Welcome to the channel, where we explore the life and lessons of great biblical leaders. And today we are focusing on none other than Joshua. Now, many of us are familiar with the story of Moses, who led the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt and guided them through the wilderness for 40 years. But when Moses was about to enter the promised land, he had to leave his shoes behind. Why? Because Moses wasn't worthy to enter the promised land. So God took his life at the top of Mount Nebo and gave the leadership to Joshua. That means Joshua was now responsible for conquering the promised land. What an intimidating task, right? Especially since the Israelites had been wandering around in the desert for 40 years. It could have demoralized anyone. But Joshua didn't let that happen. He remained faithful to God, leading the people with courage and determination. But there was one big problem. The Israelites were still far from Canaan, and in order to get there, they had to cross the Jordan River. And this river was wide and strong, making it impossible to pass. But Joshua didn't panic. He knew God was with him, and when the time was right, God instructed him to tell the Levites carrying the Ark of the Covenant to march into the Jordan. The water would miraculously split and allow everyone else to cross on dry land. That's exactly what happened. As soon as those Levites carrying the Ark of the Covenant stepped into the river, the water stopped flowing and stood up. And the Israelites crossed over on dry ground. On the other side, 12 men representing the 12 tribes of Israel gathered stones to commemorate their victory over the Jordan, and then they returned to their camp. From there, they journeyed to a place called Gilgal, where they pitched their tents. It was at Gilgal that something very important happened. Something that changed everything for Israel. Let me explain. When the Israelites wandered in the desert for 40 years, they did something terrible. They complained to God so much that he became very angry and decided that none of the people who complained would enter the promised land. Only 2 people, Caleb and Joshua, would be allowed to enter because they didn't complain. You can read about that in Numbers, chapter 14, verses 26 through 30. But that left a huge problem for Joshua. Almost an entire generation had died off, and now their children were ready to take the land that God had promised to their parents. But these new Israelites had never complained. How could Joshua prove that they were indeed the children of those original Israelites who complained? That's where circumcision came in. Circumcision was a sign of God's covenant with Abraham and his descendants. It was a physical reminder that they belonged to God. So God told Joshua to gather all the men in Israel and circumcise them. It was a massive undertaking. Every single man had to be circumcised. But it was also a beautiful sight. All these men gathered together, submitting themselves to this ancient covenant, reaffirming their commitment to God. This act showed that these people were indeed the descendants of Abraham and reminded them of their unique relationship with God. But it wasn't just a religious ceremony. It was a symbol of obedience and dedication. By submitting to circumcision, these men were showing their willingness to follow God's laws and live according to his covenant. This act of obedience was crucial because it marked a turning point for Israel, setting them on a path to possess the promised land. It was the first step towards fulfilling the promise made to their forefathers. Okay, let's pause for a second. So far, we've seen how Joshua led the Israelites across the Jordan River and how he oversaw the act of mass circumcision that showed their commitment to God. But now we are about to witness an incredible miracle, one that will change the course of Israel's history forever. You see, after crossing the Jordan, the Israelites faced their first major obstacle, the city of Jericho. It was a well-fortified city with high walls that seemed impenetrable. But God had already given the Israelites the instructions on how to conquer it. Joshua chapter 6, verse 2 tells us, "And the Lord said to him, See, I have delivered Jericho into your hand, and its king into your hand. And the whole silver and gold that is in his treasury you shall take, and from all the good things of the city you shall plunder each man for himself." In other words, God told Joshua that Jericho and all its treasures would belong to Israel. But how were they going to capture such a well-defended city? The answer lay in the seemingly simple instructions God had given. Joshua gathered the Israelites and instructed them to march around the city once every day for 6 days. On the 7th day, they would march 7 times and shout, and then the city wall would collapse. They were to do this in obedience to God, trusting in Him for victory. Now, this must have seemed crazy. I mean, was God really going to help them defeat their enemies by having them walk around the city and shout? But Joshua and the Israelites believed. They trusted in God's plan, even though it made no sense. They marched around the city for 6 days, doing nothing, saying nothing. But on the 7th day, they shouted, and amazingly, the city walls collapsed. The Israelites charged into the city, capturing it and taking all its treasures, just as God had promised. This event, known as the Fall of Jericho, was a monumental victory for the Israelites. It was the beginning of their conquest of Canaan, the fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. Think about it. For hundreds of years, their ancestors had been enslaved in Egypt, wandering in the wilderness, and rejected by nation after nation. But now they were about to take possession of a land that was theirs by right. This victory was a testament to God's power, not the power of the Israelites. It was a clear demonstration that He was with them, that He would help them fulfill His promises. It also served as a warning to the other nations of Canaan. They should remember the fate of Jericho, because God had plans for Israel. And no force on earth could stop Him from fulfilling those plans. At this point, you might be thinking, wow, the Israelites had a pretty easy time conquering Canaan. But let me remind you, this is just the beginning of their journey. There are many more challenges ahead. In fact, God told Joshua that the Israelites would face many battles in the days to come. But Joshua didn't have to worry because he had learned an important lesson. God would be with him. And that meant victory was assured. But what does this story teach us? It teaches us about faith, obedience, and trust. Joshua and the Israelites had to trust God even when things seemed impossible. They had to obey God's instructions even when they didn't make sense. And they had to believe in God as promises, even when they could unsee how God was going to fulfill them. And when they did that, they experienced victory. You see? Just like the Israelites, we will face many challenges in our lives. There will be times when we don't know how we will succeed, when we don't understand God's plan, and when things seem impossible. But if we learn from Joshua, we will trust God, obey His word, and believe in His promises. And when we do that, we will experience victory in our lives, too. My friends, if you want to learn more about Joshua, you should check out my full series. Click here to watch the next video.